Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better and improve your game. Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk about a technique in endgames. Technique in endgames is where you're winning a one game. And there's a lot of theoretical endgames. There's a lot of theoretical king and pawn endgames. This is not going to be one of them. This is going to be something that occurs all the time that I see my students mess up. And actually, these common occurrences, these common positions where somebody's just up a pawn in the endgame, are much more common than the rare theoretical appearances, maybe with the exception of like king and pawn against king. So when somebody's up a pawn in an endgame, especially an extra healthy pawn, there's a big difference between when there's only one or two pawns on the board compared to lots of pawns on the board. There's lots of theoretical positions, and I hope to do a video soon on king and pawn against king. You could pretty much cover every possible position where you have a king and a pawn against a king and figure out whether it's a win or a draw. There's a lot of very tricky positions with king and two pawns against king and one pawn. These are all theoretical positions, but today we're going to talk about a much more practical thing, which is what happens if you're just up a pawn in the endgame. You're up a pawn, both sides have a bunch of pawns, nobody has any special pawns. You should be winning the game. How do you win the game? Alright, so let's take this king and 5 pawns versus king and 4 pawns position. And first let's start out by showing you what not to do. What I tell my students is please avoid getting into races in these positions unless you've counted ahead and you're absolutely sure you're winning the race and you're way ahead. There's no problem, because you can win the game easily anyway, so why would you want to get into a race? What's a race? A race is where both sides' kings go to different ends of the board and both sides end up with passed pawns racing to see who gets a queen first. So let's see how white could not play it here to play it wrong. Let's say white plays king e2 and black plays king d6. And let's talk a little bit about the hand waving we did in the last video. Let's say white says, oh, I have a majority on the king side, so I want to attack on the king side. And he just blindly brings his king up to the king side, and black says, okay, where are you going? And white says, I'm going up to the king side where I should be. And black says, all right, I'll race with you. And both kings go toward the pawns. This is exactly what white does not want, is to get into these kind of races. King takes a2, and now white says, oh, look, touchdown. I can even queen first. And both sides come running down the board. And white says, oh, I get a queen first. And black gets a queen. And obviously white can, win a pawn here if he wants to. But this is a hard endgame to win. Queen and pawn endgames where you're up a pawn could be difficult or impossible to win. So this is not the kind of thing you want to get into if you're white. Even though the computer might say white's a little better here, maybe even winning with perfect play, this is not going to be the kind of thing that you want to aim for. So one of the principles in these kind of king and 5 pawn versus king and 4 is keep your king on the same side of the board as your opponent's king. If you're on offense and you have a 5 and 4, and you keep your, and let's say black brings his king to the queen side and white initially brings his king to the queen side, then white can eventually move his king side pawns to create a passed pawn and then deflect the black king away, and then he could win the rest of the queen side pawns and win the game. On the other hand, if white's king goes to the king side, then, and black's king goes to the king side, then eventually you can create a passed pawn. And then there's a couple different ways to win, and we'll show you these couple different ways. And you're still winning without any races. All right, so let's do that this time. So white plays king e4, black plays king d6. Let's say white plays king d3 to keep the black king out, and black plays king e5, and white plays king e3. All right, so black's king can't really get much better. And let's say black sits here and he waits with a move like g6. All right, well, the general rule is when you have a majority like this, you want to push your unopposed pawn first. It would be a mistake for white to play g4. Then black would play g5 and make the f pawn backward and the h pawn backward. And this would cripple white's majority. And this is exactly the opposite of what white wants to do. So let's go back. So what white wants to do is play f4 check first. Now you might say, all right, but you made it easy, Dan. Why didn't black play g5 first? So okay, we'll play g5 first. All right, so white wants to get the pawn up to f4, but again, it would be a big mistake to play g3 and allow black to play g4 and make the pawns backward. So what you do first in a position like this is you just play f3 to prevent g4. You're in no rush. You don't get any extra points for winning the game with faster pawn pushes. This will just win eventually no matter what black does. So let's say black plays h5 and white plays g3. Now black again could move the king if he wants. He could play king to f5. He could move the queenside pawns. Let's say he moves the queenside pawns. If he moves the queenside pawns, white should move the pawns to keep it symmetric, to block the pawns, so that later on when he runs over there, these pawns will be fixed. And now running your king down here and racing is hopeless. White's going to get a queen way, way, way faster than black will. So this won't be much of a race. If you don't believe me, let's play it out. King d5, f4, pawn takes, pawn takes. Let's say black continues to race here. King takes, pawn up, king takes, pawn queen check. And it doesn't matter what he plays. Let's say he plays king to b3. Well, right away, white could win the a pawn just by attacking it if he wants. Or he can bring the king closer. Everything's going to win here. So let's say he wants to play king to d3, and black plays a5, and white plays check, and black has to move out. If black moves too far away from the pawns, white will just skewer the pawns and take them. So black has to kind of stick around the pawns, but where can he go and keep the king out? He really can't. So let's say king a3, and king to c3. Now white's threatening checkmate. If black checks, white just goes here. He's again threatening checkmate. If black plays here, white, he has a million ways to play this. He could just pin the pawn. Now black's kind of in zugzwang. He can't push the b pawn. h4. And now again, white has a million ways to win. He could just take this pawn, check, put the king in the way. Black's running out of moves. He has to play pawn here. White checks him away from the pawn, takes the pawn, and wins. All right, so let's go back. So it's impossible for black to race with white. White's going to get a queen way before black. So after b4, a6, a3, let's say black plays king to f5. So white has a choice here. He could play h3 first to keep the king out. That might be the easiest. Or he could just play f4 right away. All right, so let's take a look at f4. If he plays f4, then black's only chance is to play pawn takes, king g4. Going back is hopeless, as we'll see in a minute. So let's say he does play king g4. Okay, now white can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's too much, so white should be winning easily. Let's do it. King e4, king h3, f5. Let's say h4, f6, king takes, pawn up, pawn queens, king over. Let's say he plays here. Okay, lots of ways to win this position. Check. Doesn't matter where black goes. Let's say he plays king here. And now white can just win with zugzwang. He can play king f3. If black pushes the pawn, queen g2 is mate. But black has no other moves. If he plays king here, then we've got something like check, here, mate. I'm sure there's other million mates there. If black plays a5, white just takes, here, takes. He tries to stalemate himself and checkmate, of course. All right, so let's go back to where black played king to g4. So king to g4 doesn't work. So let's say black decides just to play h4 and white plays h3. Now black's in zugzwang, and this is a very basic endgame that you want to learn. There's two ways for white to win this endgame. One is by abandoning his pawn and using semi-stalemate, and the other is by winning this pawn on h4. So let's go through a couple ways to win this position. White could, it's black's move. Black would move back. White can come up. Black plays king f6, f5. Again, we can see that he can't race with him here. He's got to stay back and play defense. King back, king here, king here, king here. And now if black plays king up, then king g5 will get a queen. But if black goes back, white simply takes another pawn. And now white's got 2 pawns and wins easily. What's another method of doing this? Another method of doing this is called semi-stalemate, where white will just run black out of moves. Black always brings the king straight back here. Okay, now in this position, white has several ways to win. He could abandon this pawn and go over and take off these 2 pawns. He could go abandon the pawn and take off this pawn, but that's silly. He could have done that already. Or he can use what's called semi-stalemate. What's semi-stalemate? It's where you put the black king in zugzwang and force him to move the pawns, and you can queen first. So let's do that. f7 check, king f8, king f6, black's in semi-stalemate, a5, pawn takes, b4, and now you can't take the pawn, it's a draw. But that's the whole point. You can queen first, pawn up, doesn't matter whether he takes or not, push, up, up, and now you can get a rook or a queen, checkmate. So this is a very common way of winning. Now, you got to be careful when you're using the semi-stalemate. Notice it worked because I fixed these pawns first. If I hadn't fixed those pawns, the semi-stalemate wouldn't work. And if I had fixed them at a lower level, it wouldn't work either. Let's go back and do that just for the fun of it. So let's say black plays b5 and white plays h3 and black plays b4 and white plays b3 and black plays a5 and white plays check. Pawn takes, king f5, king f3. Black has nothing to do here. He could push the pawn or not. Let's say he doesn't. He goes straight back. And now white can push the pawn or not. I can play h4. Just as easy to play king to e4, king e6, pawn up, king here, king up, king back, king e5, king to e7, f6 check, king f7, king f5, king f6, king up, king here, pawn up, king here. Now I can actually force him to push this pawn and get the right tempo. King here, pawn push, king here, and now the problem is black doesn't have to come out. He can push the pawn, and what white should do is take, and when black goes here, white should take, and black goes here, and white goes king g7 and wins. But what if white had pushed the h-pawn so that that wasn't possible? What if white, let's say here, plays h4, and black plays here king f7, king e5, king back. You know, we could go over here and win this way. I'm just showing you how you can't win. King f8, king up, king here, pawn check, king here. Now king f6 is a big mistake because black has no moves, and if black plays a4 and white takes and black plays b3, white has to take that pawn because white can't use the semi-stalemate trick because black will be queening first and black will win. So white has to take the pawn and stalemate him. So white's thrown away the game by playing this really bad move, king to f6. So that's why it's kind of nice earlier when black plays b5 to play b4. And now the semi-stalemate trick can work too. But we don't need it, as we said. There's other ways to win. Let's do the way where we abandon the f-pawn and we win. So pawn here, black plays here. Let's say white plays h3, king e5, f4 check. There's pushing that unopposed pawn first. H takes, g takes check, king up. Let's say white plays king f3, king back, king to e4. Now black could push the pawn or move the king. Either way, he's going to lose. Let's say he plays king up, pawn check, king here, king back, king up, king here. You don't want to let the king in front of the pawn. And white, if white wants, he could stop and play h4, but let's say he doesn't. Pawn check, king here, king f5, king f8, here. Now you don't want to push the pawn. If you're going to abandon the pawn, make sure to abandon it when he's not next to it, because if you abandon the pawn when he's next to it, if anything, it might lose a tempo to get him closer to the pawn. So what you do is you just play king to d6, king f7, king c6, king takes, king here. And now clearly playing defense is impossible. So black has to race, and this is where white has to count things out before he does this. We don't want to get into races without counting. And now king takes h3, a4, h5, a5, king b6, a6, h7, and white's going to win by one tempo. Pawn here. That's why you don't get into races without counting. And white will win here, of course. If king to f2, the easiest move here for white is to play king h1, queen h1, king here. You could even sacrifice the queen for the pawn, or you can bring your king up and zugzwang his king away and win. Lots of ways to win. So if we get to that position where we abandon the pawn, we got to be very careful about counting this out before we go running away. Let's ask the computer how many winning moves white has here. We'll bring this up into the visual area. Okay, the computer says the semi-stalemate is the best. Let's say king here, king f7. Now he wants to play king e5 and go back and like do semi-stalemate again. That's kind of funny. So king c6, computer says, all right, fine, you're still winning that way. What else could you do? Well, you could play king f5, king f7, king g5, and then if he goes away from the pawn, you can just take off his h-pawn. That's pretty easy too. All right, so let's rewind the board here. All right, so tell you what, this time I'm going to play a game. I'm going to play this position against Stockfish. I'll even let Stockfish go first here. Let's see, we'll make sure it's black's move. And the computer says king d6, so I'll play king d2. The computer says h6, so I'll play king e3. He says king e6, I'll play king e4. He says, at some point, of course, the computer sees it's hopeless and kind of gives up and plays crazy moves. He plays king f6. I'm going to play f4. He plays h5. When he does that, you play h3, so you can play, g3, so you can play h3. If you play h3 here, that's a mistake because you can play h4 and make your pawn backwards. So you play g3 to prevent backward pawns. He plays king e6, and now you play h3. g3 first, just playing it slow. Computer says king f6, g4, h takes g4, h takes g4, king f7. Okay, so white can play f5, king f6, king f4, king e7, king e5, king f7, g5, king e7. All right, now I want to fix these pawns so I can go after them. So I'm going to play b4. The computer says king d7. I'm going to play f6. G takes f6. King takes f6. And now I'm just winning. If he plays king to e8, I will play king to g7 and king to h7. Let's show that. If he plays there, I play here. The computer sees all this. He plays there, I play there, and then I get a queen. So therefore, the computer wants to race with me now. Play something like king c6, g6, and now the computer sees it's hopeless. He's just playing silly moves. a6, g7, king d5, g8, queen check, king d4. At this point, I would probably just play something like queen b3, where he can't do anything, and the computer says it's mate in 8. Let's do that one more time. All right, so I'm playing white. Stockfish 10 is playing black. King d6, king d2, king e6, king e3, king e5, f4 check, king f5, king f3, h5, g3, king e6, king e4, king f6, h3. Very similar to last time, king e6. I'm going to play g4. Stockfish said I should have played f5 check. Doesn't matter. h takes g4, h takes g4. Computer says king f6. All right, if I play f5 here, he can play king to g5, which isn't bad. I mean, I'm still winning here. But here I'd probably rather block the pawns on the queen side. b4. He's not sure what to play. King e7, so king e5. King d7. I would just play f5. King c6. See, he's already giving up now. All right, so I would play g5. He plays a6. I play f6. He plays g takes f6. And again, I have to count here. If I take with the pawn, he can bring his king back. Now, I'm still winning if I do that because I can bring my king over to the queen side. So, for instance, let's say I take with the pawn. Taking with the king is the right move. Let's say I take with the pawn. If he tries to race with me, I'll just get a queen. So let's say he comes back. All right, so now I'm going to play king to d5. And he's kind of in Zugzwang here. So the computer says his best move is king to d8, but he knows that everything is hopeless. If he plays king to d8, I play king to d6. If he plays king to e8, I can play king to b7. If he plays b5, I play king b6. He plays a5, I play king takes a5, king f7, king takes b5, king takes f6, king b6, and so on. Okay, so hopefully from me playing this out multiple times, you see what I'm doing. I'm avoiding the race. I am getting my majority rolling. Notice, for instance, the key move of playing h3. Let's go back to that position. You know, when he plays h5, and when we're back here, when he plays h5 to stop g4, I don't want to play h3 first because he'll play h4 and make my pawn backward. First I play g3, then I'll play h3, then I'll play g4. And that keeps my pawn majority non-crippled and smooth and rolling. And eventually, I'm going to win by either that semi-stalemate method or abandoning the pawn. You know, you saw the different ways that I'm going to win, but by keeping my king near his king on the same side of the board, I'm always winning. And you can practice this. What you can do is set up this position at home, get out a nice engine to play against you. You can play against a friend too, of course, but if you want to show that you can beat an engine, and play this position for white, you know, so many times that you always know what to do and you can always beat the best player in the world, let's say a Stockfish or an Alpha Zero. If you can beat them every single game here, that'll give you confidence that if you trade off when you're into endgames, when you're winning, you can use things like this to just win the game. This is called good technique, and you want to play it this way so that you get confidence. I think when I got to be about 14 or 1500, I learned this, and I was like, wow, I could beat anybody in the world this way if I can get into this position. Now, of course, people like Bobby Fischer and Sammy Reshevsky and Boris Spassky and Tigran Petrosian, they weren't going to let me get into this position. But if I ever did, I could beat them too, because I'm just winning here with white. And once you learn how to win, then you can win a lot of endgames that are somewhat similar to this. You just get up a pawn. One of the things you learn about endgames is the easiest endgame to win when you're up a pawn is a king and pawn endgame. But it's also, king and pawn endgames are way trickier and more complicated in a lot of lines than, you know, piece endgames are. A lot of people think, oh, you trade things off, it makes things simpler. Well, there's a lot of king and pawn endgames where it's very, very complicated and very, very tricky. And even grandmasters make mistakes in king and pawn endgames. So you got to be careful about king and pawn endgames. You want to go to them when you're winning and avoid them when you're losing. But if you learn these basic techniques, it'll make a lot of these endgames, which are relatively straightforward, much easier to win. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed today's video about endgame technique 5 on 4. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.